Hey, welcome to Genre Chat Podcast for SeriousWriter.com. I'm Caleb Walton, and this is the first in our new series, Back to Basics. Over the next couple of weeks and months, we're going to be looking over the major genres in the industry today and just digging in really deep into the subgenres and the different categories that writers have to choose from. This week and next week, we're going to be taking kind of a broad look at the major genres and subgenres in the industry. And then the weeks after that, we'll be talking with writers from those different genres and really digging deep into the writing process and character development. But before we get started, just a little bit of a disclaimer. All of these genres that we'll be going through are sort of a general overview. You can combine and just kind of glean from each of them to create the novel that's really going to tell your story the best. So, I mean, obviously you can combine romance, thriller, suspense, fantasy, all those things. Most successful books are a really good blend of each of these genres. So this is just a general overview. We'll be giving some examples of best-selling novels in each of those genres and subgenres. But like I say, keep in mind that you can blend any of these ideas together in order to be able to tell your story the best way possible. But it's important for especially new writers to be familiar with each of the genres in the industry, so that you'll know the audience that you are marketing your book toward. Always write your novel in a way that you have in mind where it'll be sitting in the bookstore or where someone would go to find it on Amazon. That way you'll know what you're marketing it for and who your audience will be. But let's go ahead and get started. So anybody that's looked on Amazon recently knows that there are literally countless genres and subgenres for fiction today, but I've managed to narrow them down into the four most basic genres. So we've got suspense, thriller, romance, fantasy, and science fiction. This week we'll be taking a look at suspense, thriller, and science fiction. Next week we'll look over at romance and fantasy. But just to start with suspense and thriller, this is the largest, arguably the largest genre in fiction today. It's very, very popular. Always see suspense thriller novels on the top of the bestseller list. So the major subgenres in suspense and thriller novels: police procedurals, supernatural suspense, cozy mysteries, legal and medical thrillers, psychological thrillers, and military thrillers. And we'll be taking a quick look at examples from each of these from today's best-selling authors. Now, James Patterson is a great author of police procedural novels, and his Alex Cross series is a great example of that as well. So just to take a really quick look at the summary for this book. In a Virginia penitentiary, Alex Cross and his partner John Sampson witnessed the execution of a killer they helped convict. Hours later, they're called to the scene of a copycat crime. A note signed M rests on the corpse. "You messed up big time, Dr. Cross." Was an innocent man just put to death? Alex soon realizes he may have much to answer for, as M lures the detective out of the Capitol to the sites of multiple homicides, all marked with distressingly familiar details. Details that conjure up decades-old cases. Details that conjure up cross-family secrets. Details that make it clear that M is after a prize so dear, were the killer to attain it, Alex's heart would no longer have a reason to beat. This is a perfect example of police procedurals, following a criminal investigator, usually a detective or an FBI agent, trying to chase down a criminal. Now, a really good way to separate police procedurals from, let's say, cozy mysteries is that police procedurals are usually a crime fighter trying to prevent a crime from being committed or prevent a killer from escaping, whereas cozy mysteries are usually investigating crimes that have already occurred. Stephen King's a great author of supernatural suspense. So supernatural suspense is anything that deals with supernatural elements. It's usually centered, it's not always centered on crime. Usually it almost bleeds over into fantasy with very paranormal elements to it, sometimes even occultic elements to it. So Stephen King's The Institute just came out. It's a really good book. I haven't had the chance to read it yet, but the summary is very gripping. In the middle of the night, in a house on a quiet street in suburban Minneapolis, intruders silently murder Luke Ellis's parents and load him into a black SUV. The operation takes less than 2 minutes. Luke will wake up at the Institute in a room that looks just like his own, except there's no window. And outside his door are other doors, behind which are other kids with special talents, telekinesis, and telepathy, who got to this place the same way Luke did. Kalisha, Nick, George, Iris, and 10-year-old Avery Dixon, they are all in front half. Others, like Luke, Luke learns, graduated to back half, like the Roach Motel, Kalisha says. You check in, but you don't check out. And this most sinister of institutions, the director, Mrs. Zigsby, and her staff are ruthlessly dedicated to extracting from these children the force of their extra-normal gifts. There are no scruples here. If you go along, you get tokens for the vending machines. If you don't, punishment is brutal. As each new victim disappears to back half, Luke becomes more and more desperate to get out and get help, but no one has ever escaped from the Institute. This is a perfect example of supernatural suspense. So children with supernatural elements, institutions, sinister plots to sort of discover the secret behind their powers. These are all really common threads in supernatural suspense novels. Now, Joanne Fluke is a great author of cozy mysteries. And I was mentioning earlier, cozy mysteries usually follows a small town detective or private investigator that is trying to unravel the mystery behind a crime that's already been committed in sort of a whodunit style of book. So this book series she's got here, it's the Hannah Swenson series, and these books were actually adapted by Hallmark into made-for-TV movies. So they're a great example of cozy mysteries. This particular one follows Hannah Swenson is a small-town bakery owner in Lake Eden, Minnesota, and she finds a murder victim in her bakery, and it sort of has to do with some different relations that she has with people in town, one of her competitors, and so she's trying to figure out who killed this woman, why her body was found in her bakery shop, and so she's also dealing with different familial relations and different sort of romantic elements at the same time. So it doesn't deal with too grisly of a crime or a murder, and it's really a whodunit to sort of solve the mystery of who murdered this woman. These are really charming books. It's a very cute series, and it's a really good example of cozy mysteries. John Grisham is a great example of legal thrillers. He's actually an ex-lawyer. He's written some of the most best-selling novels of the 21st century, and he always sort of zeroes in on a lawyer sort of taking on a really big case, sort of an underdog story. This book, The Rooster Bar, just came out, I believe it was last year, and this is just a quick summary of it. Mark, Todd, and Zola came to law school to change the world and to make it a better place. But now as third-year students, these close friends realize they have been duped. They all borrowed heavily to attend a third-tier for-profit law school so mediocre that its graduates rarely pass the bar exam, let alone get good jobs. And when they learn that their school is one of a chain owned by a shady New York hedge fund operator who also happens to own a bank specializing in student loans, the three know they have been caught up in the great law school scam. But maybe there's a way out. Maybe there's a way to escape their crushing debt, expose the bank and the scam, and make a few bucks in the process. But to do so, they would first have to quit school. And leaving law school a few short months before graduation would be completely crazy, right? Well, yes and no. Pull up a stool, grab a cold one, and get ready to spend some time at the Rooster Bar. Once again, great example of a legal thriller. John Grisham always turns out really awesome legal thrillers. Usually underdog stories trying to take on a big corporation, a lot of conspiracy, a lot of legal drama in that. Psychological thrillers usually follow the emotional and mental unraveling of the main character. So there's usually an element of mental instability. A lot of times it deals with crime. Sometimes it deals with some supernatural elements as well. Ted Decker's Eyes Wide Open is a great example of that. It's a bit of a fantasy novel, a bit of a science fiction. But it does deal with a lot of psychological elements, as does this novel here, The Silent Patient. Just came out and it's already at the top of all the bestseller lists. Just to take a quick look at the summary, perfect example of a psychological thriller. Alicia Berenson's life is seemingly perfect. A famous painter married to an in-demand fashion photographer, she lives in a grand house with big windows overlooking a park in one of London's most desirable areas. One evening, her husband Gabriel returns home late from a fashion shoot, and Alicia shoots him 5 times in the face and then never speaks another word. Alicia's refusal to talk or give any kind of explanation turns a domestic tragedy into something far grander, a mystery that captures the public imagination and casts Alicia into notoriety. The price of her art skyrockets, and she, the silent patient, is hidden away from the tabloids and spotlight at the Grove, a secure forensic unit in North London. Theo Faber is a criminal psychotherapist who has waited a long time for the opportunity to work with Alicia. His determination to get her to talk and unravel the mystery of why she shot her husband takes him down a twisting path into his own motivations, a search for the truth that threatens to consume him. Perfect example of a psychological thriller following this woman's sort of mental unraveling and the sort of quest to figure out what is wrong with her and why she's done the things she has. A great example there. Military thrillers are very, very popular. Tom Clancy, Lee Child, they're really, really good examples of military thriller writers, as is Stephen Connolly. His book, The Rescue, is a perfect example of this. Now, this genre is very similar to police procedurals and different, just general suspense and thriller novels, in that it does follow a crime. It is trying to catch a criminal or a terrorist. And there is a lot of risk to keep some other catastrophic event from happening, to rescue someone that's been kidnapped, to stop a bomb from going off, or a biological weapon to be released. Things like that are very common threads in military thrillers. One thing that sort of sets this subgenre off to itself is that it does deal with a lot of very broad-reaching risk. So it usually deals with international espionage, international conspiracy, or terrorism, and there are global scale threats at stake. So the stakes are very high, and it usually deals with either branches of the government, or in this case, the CIA. Let's see. Science fiction. It's a genre that has broken many boundaries. A lot of good inventions have come forward because of science fiction books and movies. So we're just going to take a look at some of the subgenres here. I'm a little biased because I am a science fiction writer, so science fiction is my personal favorite, and some of my favorite books fall into these categories. So we've got dystopian and utopian, space opera, steampunk, hard science fiction, and speculative. Now, if you haven't read The Hunger Games, honestly, I would be completely surprised. Just about everyone has either read the book or seen the movie. It's a classic example of dystopian fiction. Just a quick look at the summary, if for some reason that I can't fathom, you don't know what the book is about. In the ruins of a place once known as North America lies the nation of Panem, a shining capital surrounded by 12 outlying districts. The capital is harsh and cruel and keeps the districts in line by forcing them all to send one boy and one girl between the ages of 12 and 18 to participate in the annual Hunger Games, a fight to the death on live TV. 16-year-old Katniss Everdeen regards it as a death sentence when she steps forward to take her sister's place in the games. But Katniss has been close to dead before, and survival for her is second nature. Without really meaning to, she becomes a contender. But if she is to win, she will have to start making choices that weigh survival against humanity and life against love. Dystopian novels usually take place in this type of sort of bleak future that has befallen some sort of usually unnamed catastrophe. A lot of times it's apocalyptic style, or sometimes it's like the Hunger Games and takes place in sort of a dystopian oppressive government. Similar to dystopian novels are utopian novels, which I guess a good example of this would be the novel The Giver. It was also made into a really good movie. So that would follow a sort of utopian society, so a society that's seemingly perfect. And typically these novels take a really hard look at the society that is seemingly perfect and sort of uncovers some sinister elements to maybe why it's not as perfect as it seems. Very, very popular genre, especially in young adult fiction. We see this in the Hunger Games, the Divergent series, the Maze Runner. It's a really, really popular genre for young adults. Now, Dune by Frank Herbert is a classic science fiction novel, and it's also considered a space opera. Now, space opera is a subgenre of science fiction. This is what I guess you would consider Star Wars is considered to be a space opera. It generally follows a cast of characters in a science fiction setting, but unlike typical sci-fi stories, there's a bit of romance to it. And I don't mean romance as in like a boy meets girl love story, even though that's sometimes present. Romance as in it includes mysticism, destiny, coming of age, a sweeping cast of characters, familial relations and struggles, a lot of monarchy and societal struggles, overthrowing the government, things like that. If you think about Star Wars, it has a lot of mystical elements. It has a lot of of heartbreak and secrets and love and destiny, and a lot of things that you would find in operas, which is why it's called a space opera. It's an opera set in space. And Dune is another really great example of this. Set on the desert planet Arrakis, Dune is the story of the boy Paul Atreides, I'm probably butchering these names, heir to a noble family tasked with ruling an inhospitable world where the only thing of value is the spice melange, a drug capable of extending life and enhancing consciousness. Coveted across the known universe, it's a prize worth killing for. When the house of Atreides is betrayed, the destruction of Paul's family will set the boy on a journey toward a destiny greater than he could ever have imagined. And as he evolves into the mysterious man known as Maudip, he will bring to fruition humankind's most ancient and unattainable dream. This is a really classic example of a space opera. It's a very long book series. I think there's 5 or 6 novels there, and once again, I apologize, but I probably butchered all of those science fiction names. Mortal Engines is a good example of steampunk, and steampunk is a genre that's really hard to sort of sum up in 1 or 2 phrases. Generally, it has a lot of science fiction and Victorian elements. So it's going to be dealing with the sort of culture and society of Victorian England. There's usually a reference to there's usually a reference to Queen Victoria. The fashion, the architecture, the setting is very Victorian, but it has a lot of science fiction elements. Usually not like space travel or like really big science fiction concepts or like Star Trek type technology. Usually very primitive and fictitious technologies that revolve around gears, clockwork, steam, coal engines. Mortal Engines is a great example of this. And even though it doesn't take place in Victorian London, it takes place in a version of Victorian London that is reconstructed in the far distant future. It's a really great book. It was made into a movie produced by Peter Jackson. I saw it and it was a really awesome example of steampunk. Very interesting characters. There was a lot of like Victorian style monarchical government. It was a really good book. Red Rising is an excellent example of hard science fiction. It's been described as the Hunger Games set in space. So hard science fiction is usually set in space or in the distant future. It usually deals with a lot of speculative technology, fictitious science technology, and has to do a lot with space travel and different types of science fiction there. To take a quick look at the summary of this, Darrow is a Red, the member of the lowest caste in the color-coded society of the future. Like his fellow Reds, he works all day, believing that he and his people are making the surface of Mars livable for future generations. Yet he toils willingly, trusting that his blood and sweat will one day result in a better world for his children. But Darrow and his kind have been betrayed. Soon he discovers that humanity reached the surface generations ago. Vast cities and lush wilds spread across the planet. Darrow and Reds like him are nothing more than slaves to a decadent ruling class. Inspired by a longing for justice and driven by the memory of lost love, Darrow sacrifices everything to infiltrate the legendary institute, a proving ground for the dominant gold caste, where the next generation of humanity's overlords struggle for power. He will be forced to compete for his life and the very future of civilization against the best and most brutal of society's ruling class. There, he will stop at nothing to bring down his enemies, even if it means he has to become one of them to do so. I personally read this book. It was amazing, a really good page turner keeping you on the edge of your seat. It was a really good example of hard science fiction because it did take place on another planet. It dealt with the future, space travel, a lot of technologies, genetic engineering, a lot of elements of hard sci-fi. Speculative science fiction is sort of a hard genre to pin down. It's a bit of a catch-all for anything that doesn't really fall into the other categories. It usually deals with some really outlandish scientific concept and theory that the author has completely taken to the nth degree and made a reality. That's the case with the novel Dark Matter by Blake Crouch. It's about a local physics professor, Jason Desan, who is abducted by a masked person, a masked figure, injected with an unknown type of serum, and knocked unconscious. He wakes up in another version of his life where he's a famous scientist. Him and his wife have never met. His son was never born. He's known around the world as a famous scientist who's just made a groundbreaking discovery that's just really veiled in secret as they try to figure out exactly what they've created in a secret lab. He travels. It has a lot to do with the multiverse and with different layers of reality. And I'm trying not to give too many spoilers away because it's such a good book, but it's a great example of speculative fiction. So those are the main genres and subgenres for thriller suspense novels and for science fiction. Next week we'll be taking a look at romance and fantasy, and then the week after we'll be interviewing some different authors from the different genres. What we'll do is we'll start with thriller suspense, then we'll move on to science fiction, romance, and fantasy, really digging in deep to those subgenres and taking a look at the writing process and character development. As always, don't forget to subscribe to the Serious Writer YouTube channel and go to seriouswriter.com/blog to get previous podcasts and to learn about the Serious Writer Academy. I'm Caleb Walton for SeriousWriter.com, and we will see you next week.